Have you ever noticed how powerful things can become the moment you stop giving someone the reaction they are expecting? Suddenly, the dynamic starts to shift, not because the other person has magically changed, and not because they have suddenly developed empathy, but because you have quietly removed something they relied on: access to your emotions. A lot of people believe the only way to deal with a narcissist is to block them instantly or desperately try to make them understand how deeply they hurt you. But sometimes both responses can keep your attention locked on the same person. The real goal is not to defeat them or prove that you are stronger. The goal is to reach a place where their behavior no longer controls your emotional world. If you've ever stared at your phone wondering why they suddenly stopped responding, questioned why their affection disappeared after making you feel so important, or noticed that they seemed to return just when you were finally beginning to move forward, understand that you are not alone. And if you've experienced this, ask yourself honestly, have you ever blocked someone hoping they would finally realize what they lost? Or kept the door open because you were still waiting for them to become the person you believed they could be? Your answer might help someone else recognize that their experience is real too. One of the most important things to understand about narcissistic relationships is that they are not sustained by affection alone. They are often sustained through emotional access. Whether you are crying, defending yourself, arguing, explaining, apologizing, or begging for another conversation, you are still giving that person access to your emotional energy. Even anger can become a form of confirmation because it shows that their behavior still has the power to disturb your peace. This is why simply blocking someone does not automatically mean you have emotionally detached from them. Blocking can absolutely be necessary and appropriate, especially when there is harassment, abuse, intimidation, or any threat to your safety. Your safety should always come first. But there is a difference between blocking someone because you have chosen peace and blocking them because you are hoping they will panic, chase you, apologize, or finally understand your value. In the second situation, they may still be occupying the center of your thoughts. You may have changed the action, but your attention is still focused on their response. The deeper transformation happens when your decision is no longer about what they will think or how they will react. It becomes about what you need to feel safe, stable, and free. Whether you completely cut contact or maintain limited communication for practical reasons, what matters most is the reason behind your choice. You are not trying to teach them a lesson. You are not waiting for them to notice your absence. You are not secretly checking whether they have finally realized your worth. You are simply choosing yourself. That is where genuine detachment begins. You stop asking, will they notice that I have changed? And start asking, am I becoming more peaceful because I have changed? Your progress is no longer measured by their reaction. It is measured by how much less power their behavior has over your emotions. Begging, on the other hand, can feel almost impossible to resist when you have been emotionally worn down by this kind of relationship. After experiencing repeated cycles of intense affection, criticism, withdrawal, confusion, and sudden closeness, it is understandable that you might start believing there must be something you can say or do to finally make everything make sense. You may convince yourself that if you explain your feelings one more time, show them how loyal you have been, give them enough love, or patiently prove that you are not going anywhere, they will finally understand the pain they have caused. But this often creates an even deeper imbalance. Instead of producing the understanding you desperately want, repeatedly pleading for answers or affection can place your emotional well-being in their hands. You begin waiting for them to decide whether you deserve an explanation, another conversation, another apology, or another moment of affection. And when someone has learned that your emotional stability depends on their attention, that dynamic can become incredibly powerful. The relationship slowly stops feeling like a mutual connection and starts feeling like you are constantly trying to earn something that should never have needed to be earned. Then comes the cycle that makes everything even more confusing. They may ignore you for a while, respond with coldness, dismiss your feelings, and then suddenly become warm again. Perhaps they send one caring message or give you just enough attention to make you believe that things might finally be different. Those brief moments can feel incredibly meaningful because they appear after periods of rejection. You start focusing on the occasional kindness rather than the repeated patterns surrounding it. You begin chasing the possibility of who they might become instead of accepting what their consistent behavior is showing you. This is one reason people can remain emotionally attached even when they know the relationship is hurting them. The uncertainty itself can keep hope alive. You are not only missing the person, you are waiting for the version of them that appeared during the good moments to return permanently. But healing begins when you stop trying to convince someone else to recognize your worth. You do not need to win an argument to prove that your feelings were valid. You do not need one final explanation before you are allowed to move forward. And you do not need their apology before you can decide that you deserve peace. The strongest shift happens when you stop asking, how can I make them understand me? And start asking, how can I understand myself better after everything I've experienced? That is when your attention begins moving away from their behavior and back toward your own life. You stop chasing closure from the person who created the confusion and begin creating closure through your own decisions. You stop trying to control their emotions and start protecting your own. You stop measuring your value by whether they choose you and start recognizing that your value was never theirs to determine. That is what real narcissist recovery begins to look like. Not revenge, not another emotional battle, and not waiting for them to finally change, but quietly becoming so grounded in your own self respect that their ability to manipulate your emotions begins to disappear. Your worth was never created by their approval, and it cannot be taken away because they refuse to apologize, accept responsibility, or change their behavior. You do not need their permission to move forward, and you do not need to keep explaining yourself until they finally agree with your version of events. The moment you stop pleading for recognition and stop trying to prove that your feelings are legitimate, something important begins to return to you: your dignity. Your emotional health becomes your responsibility again instead of something another person can control with affection, rejection, criticism, or silence. One of the most powerful changes you can make during narcissist recovery is learning emotional neutrality. This does not mean becoming heartless or pretending that the pain never affected you. It means developing the ability to pause and choose your response instead of automatically reacting to whatever someone does. Manipulative people often depend on emotional intensity because strong reactions give them information. Anger shows them what triggers you. Defensiveness shows them where you feel vulnerable. Tears can reveal how deeply their behavior affects you, while excessive efforts to please them can show how badly you want their approval. When you remain composed, the familiar pattern becomes harder to maintain. You no longer feel compelled to answer every accusation, correct every distortion, or spend hours explaining something to someone who has already chosen not to understand it. You begin realizing that not every accusation deserves a defense and not every misunderstanding requires a lengthy explanation. Your calm consistency takes away much of the emotional fuel that keeps unhealthy interactions going. When there is no dramatic reaction to feed the conflict, manipulation often becomes less effective because the expected emotional reward is no longer there. But emotional neutrality is not only about changing the way they experience you, it also protects you. Living through constant emotional highs and lows can keep you in a prolonged state of tension, making it harder to think clearly and easier to make decisions based on fear, guilt, or hope. When you slow down and remain grounded, you can look at what is actually happening instead of getting lost in what you wish were happening. You begin recognizing repeated patterns rather than becoming distracted by isolated moments. Instead of asking why they were kind yesterday or cruel today, you start looking at the larger pattern of behavior. Instead of analyzing every mood, you begin noticing what the relationship consistently does to your peace. That change in perspective is powerful because your attention starts returning to where it belongs: yourself. You become more aware of your boundaries, your needs, your values, and the kind of life you want to build. Confidence grows when your emotional stability is no longer dependent on whether someone praises you or criticizes you. The less time you spend trying to prove your intentions, defend your character, or earn someone's approval, the more energy becomes available for rebuilding yourself. You begin moving from emotional survival toward genuine self-respect. Silence can become another powerful form of protection when it is used with intention. Many people feel they have to respond to every accusation, answer every message, correct every lie, and defend themselves against every unfair statement. But constant engagement can keep you trapped in the very dynamic you are trying to escape. Some people provoke arguments because they genuinely want to solve a problem, while others may create conflict simply because conflict keeps your attention fixed on them. They may twist your words, make accusations, introduce confusion, or suddenly change the subject whenever you attempt to reach a real resolution. If you respond emotionally every time, the cycle continues. Choosing not to engage when a conversation has become manipulative is not the same thing as giving someone the silent treatment to punish them. There is a major difference between withholding communication as a weapon and stepping away because you recognize that the conversation is no longer productive. Healthy silence says, I do not have to participate in this. You begin understanding that some conversations are not actually about finding the truth or reaching mutual understanding. They are about getting you emotionally involved. When you stop supplying that reaction, you interrupt the pattern. More importantly, silence gives you something that constant arguing cannot give you: time. You get a moment to breathe before responding. You can separate facts from accusations and your own feelings from someone else's attempt to manipulate them. That pause can prevent you from sending the message you will later regret, making a decision out of anger, or apologizing simply because you feel pressured to restore peace. You become more deliberate. Your choices begin reflecting your principles rather than being dictated by someone else's behavior. And while your silence may make it more difficult for a manipulative person to predict your reactions, that should not be the reason you practice it. The purpose is not to make them uncomfortable or force them to chase you. The purpose is to create room for your own peace. If this message is helping you recognize patterns you have experienced, take a moment to support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Narcissist Recovery. Each week, we explore manipulation, emotional healing, boundaries, and the psychology behind unhealthy relationships so you can recognize these patterns sooner and protect your peace more effectively. Another major trap after leaving or distancing yourself from a narcissistic relationship is continuing to give that person your attention. You may find yourself rereading old messages, analyzing conversations, watching their social media activity, searching for hidden meanings, or wondering whether they finally understand what they lost. These thoughts can feel almost automatic, especially after a relationship filled with confusion and inconsistency. But every moment spent monitoring them is attention that could have been directed toward rebuilding your own life. Attention is not unlimited. It is one of the most valuable forms of mental energy you have. Where you repeatedly place it will influence what grows inside your mind. If your attention remains fixed on their actions, their new relationships, their opinions, or their possible reactions, your emotional connection can continue even when the relationship itself has ended. Real recovery begins when you gradually redirect that attention toward yourself. Instead of asking what they are doing, ask what you are building. Instead of wondering whether they miss you, ask whether you are finally learning to enjoy your own life again. Instead of searching for evidence that they regret losing you, look for evidence that you are becoming calmer, stronger, and more emotionally independent. That is where your freedom begins. Whatever receives most of your attention will eventually influence the way you think, feel, and make decisions. When your mind remains constantly focused on a narcissist, your life can slowly begin revolving around their behavior instead of your own direction. You may find yourself putting off opportunities, withdrawing from people who genuinely care about you, or questioning your own confidence because you are still emotionally reacting to what they say and do. Reclaiming your attention means making a deliberate decision to bring your mental energy back to your own life. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out why they acted a certain way, start asking yourself a more important question. What do I need right now to feel secure, respected, and emotionally healthy? Rather than constantly studying their motives, invest that energy into rebuilding your identity. Learn something you've always wanted to learn. Return to a hobby you abandoned. Spend time with people who make you feel valued. Create goals that have nothing to do with the relationship. Take care of responsibilities you may have neglected while you were emotionally overwhelmed. Every one of these choices sends a quiet message to your own mind that your existence is much bigger than what happened with this person. Recovery is not always a straight line, and you should not expect yourself to stop thinking about them instantly. There may be days when an old memory suddenly appears, a question comes back, or you feel tempted to check what they are doing. That does not mean you have failed. Healing means that those thoughts no longer decide what you do next. You can notice the thought without following it. You can remember what happened without reopening the entire emotional cycle. Each time you redirect your attention towards your own goals instead of their behavior, you weaken the pattern that once kept you emotionally connected to them. Slowly, your mind becomes less occupied with what they might be thinking and more interested in what you want your future to look like. Your confidence begins returning because you are proving to yourself that you can make decisions without needing their approval. Your sense of identity becomes stronger because it is no longer built around managing someone else's emotions, and your life begins to feel like yours again. That is an important part of narcissist recovery. Understanding that freedom is not simply the absence of another person, it is the presence of a life that no longer requires their involvement to feel meaningful. When a narcissist realizes that they no longer have the same emotional access to you, their response can be very different from one person to another. There is no guaranteed reaction, no fixed sequence that everyone will follow, and no reason to assume that every person will suddenly behave in the same way. Their response can depend on their personality, the history of the relationship, the level of attachment, and the patterns they have developed over time. Some may act as though they do not care at all, while others may suddenly make an effort to reconnect. The important thing is not to become obsessed with predicting which reaction will happen. Whatever they do is not necessarily proof of personal growth, genuine accountability, or a sudden realization of how deeply they hurt you. Sometimes a person may unexpectedly become warm and affectionate again. They may send friendly messages, bring up memories from the early days of the relationship, offer an apology that avoids real responsibility, or behave as though the previous problems never existed. This can be especially confusing because it may remind you of the version of them you originally trusted. In another situation, they may take the opposite approach and become hostile, dismissive, critical, or deliberately provocative. They may make indirect comments, reach out at unexpected times, or say something designed to pull you back into an emotional conversation. These behaviors can look completely different on the surface, but the result can be similar. Your attention becomes focused on them again. There is also another possibility that people sometimes struggle with. They may simply stop reaching out and direct their attention somewhere else. If part of you is hoping they would eventually come back, admit what they did, or finally recognize your value, their lack of response can feel painful. But whether they return, disappear, become affectionate, become hostile, or appear completely unaffected does not determine your worth. Their reaction is not a measurement of how important you were, and their willingness or unwillingness to acknowledge the damage does not decide whether your experience was real. One of the healthiest things you can do is stop treating every action as a secret message that needs to be decoded. You do not need to watch their social media for clues, analyze the timing of their messages, or constantly wonder whether they regret losing you. The more you search for meaning in their behavior, the more power their behavior continues to hold over your emotional state. Instead, let your boundaries remain based on what you know you need. If contact consistently creates confusion, distance may be necessary. If communication cannot be avoided because of practical responsibilities, keep it focused and appropriate. The goal is not to make them regret anything. The goal is to make your own well-being less dependent on what they choose to do next. That is where lasting freedom begins. And this is also why boundaries should never be confused with punishment. A boundary is not a strategy designed to hurt someone, make them jealous, or force them to change. A healthy boundary is a decision about what you will and will not participate in because you understand what protects your peace. It is not about controlling another person's behavior. It is about taking responsibility for your own choices. When you establish boundaries from self-respect rather than revenge, You no longer need the other person to agree with them for those boundaries to matter. Your peace becomes the priority, and your recovery stops depending on their reaction. A healthy boundary is not a weapon you use to punish someone, force an apology, or make a narcissist finally acknowledge your point of view. Its purpose is much simpler and much more important: protecting your emotional health and deciding what you will and will not allow into your life. The moment your boundaries become dependent on changing another person, they become unstable because their effectiveness is tied to whether that person cooperates. But when your boundaries come from self respect, they remain meaningful even if the other person becomes angry, dismissive, or refuses to understand. Creating stronger boundaries often starts with learning to recognize patterns instead of constantly making excuses for individual incidents. One apology does not erase a repeated pattern of dishonesty. One affectionate moment does not cancel months of disrespect. One promise does not automatically change behavior that continues to hurt you. When you begin looking at consistency rather than isolated moments, you can make decisions based on what is actually happening instead of what you hope will happen. You also realize that you do not have to explain your limits over and over again. You can communicate them clearly and then allow your actions to demonstrate what those limits mean. Consistency is what gives a boundary strength. If certain behavior repeatedly crosses a line, you do not need to keep debating whether that behavior was acceptable. You can simply decide what you will do when it happens. At the same time, it is important to leave revenge behind. Revenge can feel satisfying for a moment, but it keeps your attention emotionally attached to the person who hurt you. If your goal becomes making them jealous, showing them what they lost, proving that they were wrong, or hoping they eventually experience the same pain you experienced, they are still taking up valuable space in your mind. Your healing cannot fully move forward while your emotional energy is still being spent on what happens in their life. Real recovery requires bringing that energy back to yourself. You cannot control whether another person changes, apologizes, understands, or respects your boundaries. What you can control is how much access they have to you, how you respond to their behavior, and what standards you are willing to maintain in future relationships. Every time you enforce a healthy limit, you teach yourself that you can trust your own judgment. You begin realizing that protecting your peace does not require someone else to cooperate. That realization can rebuild confidence in a way that outside validation never could. Healing begins when you stop waiting for a narcissist to apologize, change, or finally understand your pain. Your closure does not depend on their actions. Ask instead, how have I changed? Real progress means stronger boundaries, greater self-trust, and less need to defend yourself or chase approval. You may block them or limit contact, but do it for your peace, not their reaction. The real victory is no longer needing them to validate your worth.